Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of the Inclusively You podcast, a space dedicated to amplifying the voices and highlighting persons with disabilities. I'm your host, Kayon Vaz. For those of you who are tuning in for the very first time, I would like to say a special welcome and please feel free to share the link, download the episodes, or drop us an email at inclusivelyu@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you so that you can share your very own stories. Today's conversation is one that we must have, especially for those persons who are victims and survivors of human trafficking. We'll be having an in depth conversation about human trafficking and persons with disabilities. And of course, joining us today to unpack this relevant and yet important issue is a young lady who's making an impact in her very own community. She recently graduated from St. Thomas University's Benjamin L. Crump College of Law, where she earned a JSD, that is a Doctor of Science of Law degree in intercultural human rights. She's also the president and founder of the MJ Scarlette Foundation, Inc., an organization dedicated to preventing human trafficking. The foundation works closely with law enforcement to raise community awareness to prevent this heinous crime. Inclusively, you listeners, please help me welcome Dr. Tamara Dawes. Hi, Doc.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us for our podcast. For our listeners, just to set a bit of context, can you just share with us what is human trafficking?
So, the basic definition of human trafficking is using force, fraud, or coercion to exploit someone for sex, labor, or organ trafficking. However, the elements of force, fraud, or coercion are not necessary if someone is under the age of 18 years old.
Can you share with us why persons that are disabled are pretty much targeted for human
Abs-
trafficking?
Absolutely. Traffickers are they're very good at targeting people with different vulnerabilities and try to isolate them from their families and friends, and especially individuals with disabilities. They're often, taken care of by family members or friends or guardians or even resident caregivers who often have absolute control over those individuals. Therefore, they have access to traffic them, sometimes by withholding their assisted devices such as wheelchairs or walkers, or even theft of their social security and disabilities checks. So because they're reliant on that individual has easy access to traffic them for various reasons, for sex or labor.
And it's funny that you should mention about the actual SSI, that social security income, pretty much, because there was a case which you shared with me, a case in Pennsylvania where Linda Weston and four co-defendants pretty much were charged with sex trafficking because they held six adults with cognitive disabilities and forced them into labor and sexual servitude for years. Based on your background and how you've been working with law enforcement organizations to bring awareness to your community, what can you share with listeners, persons who may live in communities and have seen individuals who are disabled? What are some of the telltale signs that individuals should look out for if they suspect that persons with disabilities are being trafficked?
Maybe the person doesn't leave a house. That's one thing, because sometimes traffickers lock the person up, unfortunately, and that's the way that they isolate them. You can also check if there are like bruises that are, healing at different stages. That's another telltale sign. Somebody who might be very withdrawn, even though the person have disability, but it might be someone who was very very outgoing, but now they've become very withdrawn and secluded. Someone who seems to be distressed, going through, they're going through mental changes where before they were very engaging, and now all of a sudden they're withdrawn. They don't want to talk, because sometimes they're afraid that they may end up telling someone that they're being trafficked, and they're afraid of repercussions by their perpetrators, because there have been instances where perpetrators have threatened to kill even their victims if they tell anyone that they're being trafficked. So,
Mm.
which is why the force, fraud, or coercion, that fear of bodily harm to yourself or to your family member might prevent you from telling someone that you're being trafficked.
And as it relates to persons with disabilities, how do they become victims though? I think that is something that we definitely need to explore. Is it that individuals approach them and say, hey, I can take care of you? Or do they present themselves as caregivers or someone who wants to offer assistance? Can you break down that profile for us, for those individuals who are actually the perpetrators of human trafficking, especially for the disabled community?
So, one general statistic is that about 40% of sex trafficking is familial trafficking, meaning that the trafficking is done by a family member, and that's whether the person is disabled or not disabled. Another important thing to know is that traffickers are not like kidnappers that are just, dragging someone off the street like that. They're very patient, they're very coy. Most of the time, it's somebody that it's a family member, it's a friend, it's an acquaintance, it's someone who's gained your trust, especially with people with disability. It could be their caretaker, it could be a family member, it could be a guardian, because most times or often people with disabilities rely on someone else to help them, especially to function, to do basic functions daily that you and I would be able to do on our own. And because of that reliance, they're vulnerable for that person to say, I am not going to do these specific things for you unless you do these favors for me.
Mm.
So, generally people with disabilities are not trafficked, but when it does happen, it's cases where, especially for young girls who rely on someone else to take care of them, they're particularly vulnerable to sex trafficking.
Mm.
It can also be labor trafficking. For instance, a well-known case to me, a family that I've met who have attended my programs. The lady, she was visually impaired and she had two children, and she met someone online and they had spoken for over a year and developed a romantic relationship, because that is one way that traffickers target victims, by portraying to be your romantic partner. So in her mind, she was having a relationship with this guy. In his mind, he was actually just using her. After a year of talking with her online, he invited her to move to another state with her daughters, and she did. When she moved, she realized that, he was living in an abandoned house, and he had her, and he also had, and her two daughters, and another mother and her two daughters. But what he had done was isolated her from her family. So she wasn't able to make contact with her mother or anything like that. And he was actually doing a peddling ring, peddling, panhandling, begging. Those are actually labor trafficking. So he would have her and her daughter and the other family. They would be out begging money in the days. Hypothetically, if they made $600, he would only give them $50, and of course he would be watching them, so they couldn't tell anyone what was going on. Fortunately and unfortunately, he became ill, and she was able to escape because he was very ill, and she called her mother, who was able to make arrangements for her and her children to fly back to the state where they're originally from.
Mm.
Unfortunately, she became ill, and within a year she died of cancer. But the good thing is that her daughters are now with her mother, and are not, if she had died where her traffickers was, then, maybe he would have started using her young daughters for sex trafficking.
And
So
that,
back to your, go ahead.
no, go ahead, go ahead.
I was going to
Uh,
say, so back to your original question, because of the reliance on someone else to help them often in their, make daily decisions and to do daily activities, people with disabilities become vulnerable to trafficking.
and it's funny because it speaks to the sort of persistence these perpetrators exhibit in waiting. That was a long time to wait, having that sort of pretense, keeping up with that pretense for a year in order to have accessibility to this mother and her daughters. So let me ask, it segues into another question. Traffickers will target a specific age group? Is that children, or is it that single mothers or any sort of parent with a young child that is disabled? Is that the kind of MO that they have?
No, so before I answer your question, I'm going to say this. Trafficking is a very lucrative business. Traffickers
Mm,
make sometimes more than $200,000 a year from selling one person. I repeat, they
wow.
make sometimes more than $200,000 a year from selling one person. So if a trafficker has 10 victims, can you imagine how much
Yeah,
money they are making?
that is
So this is
serious.
a job for them
Mm-hmm.
and a job that pays well, unfortunately.
Right.
So go back to your question. Anyone can become a victim of trafficking. Man,
Okay.
woman, boy, girl, it doesn't matter the age. Trafficking does not discriminate. Um, there are various ways that someone can be trafficked. It can be sex trafficked. It can be labor trafficked. It can be sex trafficking can be commercial sex industry. It could be, just in somebody's home. I've known of victims that were trafficked by either their parents.
Mm-hmm.
It could be on farms. It could be in hotels, in motels. It could be, labor trafficking where it could be also in the retail industry. It could be in sorry, not retail, but also in factories.
Factories, right.
Right. There is trafficking of minors who also children who are working that are not supposed to be working. So trafficking comes in so many different forms. And as I said, it does not discriminate anyone, any age group. It could be a senior that's living in somebody's home that's working without being getting paid. That's also labor trafficking. So it
So,
comes in a lot of different forms.
and the fact that it comes in various forms for these victims of human trafficking, what happens or what are the policies in place when a person who was a victim, is it that they're relocated to a separate state? Do they have a shelter? Because I know in Jamaica, under the National Task Force Against Trafficking in Persons, they have the Trafficking in Persons Shelter, and they do a threat level assessment, assessing each case to see, if they can return to the actual communities that they're from, or do they relocate the victims? Because one case that I read about was that there was a person who was wheelchair bound, and the perpetrator kept finding them. And it wasn't until they really said, okay, what is happening? They located an actual device that was onto the wheelchair, that the person, wherever the person went in the States, they would actually find them. So I wanted to know, is there an actual policy in place in terms of how they are protected from the perpetrators attempting to find them again?
Absolutely. There are safe houses for people who are victim of trafficking. And there's a lot of different policies, a lot of laws are created. I'm from the state of, live in the state of Florida, and last July there were 4 laws that were passed that are provide greater protection for people against who were trafficked. One of them was that law enforcement needed to receive 4 hours of training to be able to identify victims of trafficking. And that's important because often a law enforcement person is the first point of contact. And there were cases where someone who was trafficked was being charged for prostitution because they're similar. So, but
Mm.
if you don't know the indicators, then you'll think someone is being a prostitute when they were being a victim of trafficking. So that was an important policy. Other policies include laws to protect victims so that they're compensated. Money is taken away from the trafficker and given to the victim as
That is
compensation. There's a lot
great.
of there's a lot of stricter penalties for traffickers to stop doing what they're doing. Also in the employment industries such as hotels, etc., because trafficking happened in hotels too.
Mm-hmm.
Their hotel workers had to receive training as to be able to know the indicators of trafficking and other industries as well. So there's a lot of laws that have been put in place to protect individuals who have been trafficked and to prevent trafficking. But the thing is that as soon as one law is passed, something else come up. Traffickers are very coy, they try to be
A
a
step
step
ahead of
ahead.
the law. Yes.
Right. I mean, just like in creating websites that they sell young ladies or young boys on. By the time the federal government take down one website, another website is put up back almost instantly. So it's a constant battle to fight against trafficking. Trafficking is a multi-billion-dollar industry with a B. So, as I said, it's a very lucrative business. So they really spend their time to figure out how to circumvent the law and to do these bad things to people because of all the money they make from doing it.
Wow, Dr. Dawes, we could sit here all day and just pretty much go through in terms of the red flags and what recommendations, the policies, because of course policies varies from country to country, but we do have a task ahead of us. We not just persons with disabilities, but all people. It's just that we, of course, know that these vulnerable groups are very much more targeted than ever. Before you go, can you just share with our listeners a bit about the uh, MJ? I don't want to mispronounce it. It's the MJ Scarlette Foundation Inc. and what you have been doing in your neck of the woods as it relates to education about human trafficking.
So MG Scarlett Foundation was named after my deceased daughter, Mia, and it's an organization that educate individuals, kids, teens, and adults on how to identify human trafficking perpetrators, know if they're being recruited, and how to protect themselves from sex trafficking. Some of the things that we do is that we have a youth summit where we educate youths about the horrors of human trafficking and online safety as well. And that's important because as I said, their youths are especially vulnerable to trafficking, so they need to know how to protect themselves. But in addition to getting the education, they also gain community service hours, school service hours for attending our workshops. We also have a women support group where women who've experienced sexual abuse or sex trafficking meet up to be able to share their stories and be that support system for each other. We also attend a lot of community events such as fairs to spread awareness in the community about human trafficking. We assist those who are homeless, and that's important because about 64% of trafficking victims reported being homeless at the time they were recruited into trafficking. So, in addition to giving out essential items, we also provide them with community resources. Another important thing is that we go into schools to train students about human trafficking and online safety. We also work very closely with law enforcement to spread awareness in the community. I've been been able to train law enforcement, including the FBI, about human trafficking prevention and awareness. Another important thing that we started recently is some of my colleagues that also went to law school with me that have doctorates in different areas of human trafficking, such as human trafficking in culture, human trafficking in youth. We have created a research and policy development committee where we're trying to identify policies that are inefficient or policies that needs to be created to provide greater protection for people that are being trafficked, and also to be able to provide toolkits so that individuals who work with people that are trafficked can be able to identify if someone is being trafficked. Because as we spoke about earlier, trafficking comes in so many different forms. And
Mm-hmm.
so, it varies by culture, it varies by community. And so you would need to know the different indicators so that you can help someone who might be vulnerable to trafficking.
Thank you so much for sharing such valuable information with us and for our listeners. I will be dropping Dr. Dawes's information in the description box for the podcast. Please remember to check out her website, mjscarlettefoundationinc.org. And of course, you can follow her on social media as well in her Instagram page, MJ Scarlette Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us this week, Dr. Tamara Dawes. A very, very informative discussion, especially for persons with disabilities and for those who support the community as well. Great initiative, Doc. You are spearheading over there in Florida as you continue to fight against human trafficking. That's where we leave you for today's Inclusively You podcast. Remember, you can listen on Google Podcast and Spotify. Until next time, I am Canvas.